You know that feeling when you've gone through something really intense and there's
Mm.
this almost, well, primal urge to share it,
Hmm.
to just lay it all out there for someone else to witness. It feels natural,
Yeah,
right?
it
Duh.
is.
But then you hear these terms like trauma dumping
Yeah.
and oversharing, and you start to question where the healthy boundary actually lies.
Yeah.
Where's that line between, needed connection and maybe pushing people away?
That's a really crucial question, and it's pretty much at the heart of what we're diving into today.
Okay.
We're going to try and unpack these ideas, trauma dumping and oversharing, especially when they relate to difficult past experiences like childhood parental trauma.
And to get a good perspective, a rounded view, we've looked at some, well, really interesting sources. We've explored conversations on the Raised by Narcissists subreddit,
That's a support forum.
right, where people share very personal experiences.
Yeah.
And then we're layering that with insights from articles in Psychology Today and Grit and Virtue, which give more of an expert psychological take on it all.
Exactly. So we have this powerful mix, the raw lived realities from a support community right alongside expert analysis. Our aim in this deep dive is really to understand the why. Why this urge to maybe overshare comes up, especially when shaped by complex trauma.
Yeah.
We'll look at how it affects relationships and ultimately try to find some ways towards more authentic connections, where we can be open without feeling like we're overwhelming others or like we have to keep everything locked inside.
Okay, so let's get right to it then. When we talk about trauma dumping and oversharing, what are the key differences we should be thinking about?
Well, Talkspace gives a useful starting point. They define trauma dumping as basically unloading traumatic experiences onto someone else without any warning or invitation.
Oh, okay.
The motivation behind it, they suggest, often centers around seeking validation, maybe attention or sympathy. The really critical part here is the lack of agreement, that shared consent to talk about something so heavy.
Right, so it's less like a conversation and more like an emotional surprise attack, maybe.
Hmm.
That's a pretty vivid way to put it, yeah. And Talkspace contrasts this with venting, which they describe as more of a controlled, safer release of difficult feelings.
Yeah.
Venting, in their view, means you're considering the other person's emotional limits,
Yeah.
sharing with an awareness of their capacity to actually listen.
Hmm.
But what's really interesting, and this comes up in both the Reddit talks and the Psychology Today piece, is how subjective these labels are.
Yeah, I can see that.
What feels like necessary sharing for healing to one person might feel like dumping to someone else entirely. So the difference isn't just what you share, but the context, the consent. Did you ask first?
Yeah.
And maybe the underlying reason, especially for people whose boundaries were, well, violated growing up.
That makes a lot of sense. It really highlights that it's about the interaction, the relationship dynamics, not just the information itself.
Exactly.
So let's get into those lived experiences on the Raised by Narcissists subreddit. What were some of the main questions and perspectives that came up there? Well, the first post from a user called Wasted Wonderland really hit a core problem. They asked, how do we decide who to share what with and when and how much?
Wow, yeah. That's the big question, isn't it?
It absolutely resonated. It just showed this big area of uncertainty for so many people dealing with the fallout from narcissistic parenting.
And what kind of answers or thoughts did that question bring up? What were people saying?
Several really important themes popped up. First, there was this strong agreement on the basic human need to share tough stuff, as a way to connect and heal.
Hmm.
Some people pointed out, look, this is ancient. Humans did this long before therapy existed. Communities supported each other.
Hmm.
And positive experiences with support groups, like Al-Anon was mentioned specifically, were seen as really valuable for finding that understanding and empathy. So these online spaces,
Bingo.
they can be incredibly validating.
It sounds like those communities can really offer that feeling of, okay, I'm not alone in this.
Totally. But the discussions also highlighted how hard it can be to find that same support in everyday life. Friends might be busy, or they might just not get it, especially the specifics of complex trauma from a narcissistic parent.
Yeah, that's tough.
So it creates this tension, right, between wanting to be open and honest in your relationships because sharing can help you grow closer, and the real fear of burdening people or getting negative reactions.
And what kinds of negative reactions were people worried about?
Things like being dismissed or judged or feeling like their pain was being turned into some kind of trauma contest, as one person put it, just feeling invalidated.
Oof, yeah.
The phrase friends are not therapists came up a lot. which points to needing healthy boundaries and give and take in friendships. People understood the need to be careful about causing secondary trauma, and even the idea of asking permission before sharing really heavy things.
That idea of asking for consent first, that feels really key.
It absolutely is. And the cost of therapy was a big issue for many there, making these informal networks feel like the only option sometimes.
Right, the practicalities.
Yeah. And coping-wise, people talked about things like avoidance or downplaying things, or what one user called the slow trickling of information, bit by bit.
Interesting.
And pets. Pets came up as great non-judgmental
Well,
listeners.
yeah, can't argue with that. A furry friend is always there.
Definitely. Also, the idea of summarizing, focusing on the emotional core, not every single graphic detail as a way to share without overwhelming.
That makes sense. Give the gist.
Yeah. And a really sad point that came up was this feeling of being emotional lepers. Like a fear that sharing their abuse history would make others see them as damaged or even contagious somehow.
Wow, that's incredibly sad and powerful.
It really is. The Reddit threads also showed mixed experiences with therapists. Some found amazing support, especially from trauma-informed therapists who really got it and helped with boundaries.
That's good to hear.
But others felt unheard, even invalidated, by therapists who didn't seem to grasp complex trauma or narcissistic abuse.
Which probably makes peer support feel even more vital.
Exactly. It highlighted why those shared experiences in non-professional settings are so important for many. And finally, the discussion touched on distinguishing genuine support seeking from what might feel like manipulative trauma dumping, and the simple advice of asking others if they actually have the capacity to listen right now.
So a real mix there. A lot about boundaries, consent, finding understanding wherever you can, professional, peer-based, even pets. Okay, let's switch gears to the psychological viewpoints.
Yeah.
How do Psychology Today and Grit and Virtue link this oversharing tendency back to childhood trauma?
Well, the Psychology Today article makes a pretty direct link between adult oversharing and childhood experiences like emotional abuse, gaslighting, betrayal. The author explains that some parents, particularly those with certain personality traits, might demand that their kids share everything, every thought, every feeling, and they react badly, maybe punitively, if the child tries to keep anything private.
Wow.
So this creates a situation where the child learns, essentially, that oversharing is a survival tactic. It's how you avoid punishment or emotional fallout.
That sounds incredibly invasive, like having no internal space allowed. I think the article had an example with Shay and her mother.
Yes, that's right. She just mentions thinking about a scarf she saw. That's it. Her mother immediately jumps to thinking Shay hates her, wants to leave her.
Just from a scarf.
Just from a scarf. And even when Shay tries to explain reasonably, the mother escalates, accuses her of being ungrateful, regrets having kids. This constant, misproportionate negative reaction basically trains the child. Privacy is bad. Volunteering information first is safer.
That's like conditioning them to preemptively confess everything just to manage the parent's reaction.
Exactly. And the article also talks about over-justification as another form of this.
Okay, what's that?
It stems from that same deep need to explain yourself constantly to avoid scrutiny. The example was Shay and her friend Dee about cat sitting.
Right.
She gives like 5 different reasons why she can't do it, when in a healthy dynamic, a simple, sorry, I can't make it would be fine. By over-justifying, she kind of opens the door for her reasons to be picked apart or argued with. It's a learned behavior from childhood, rooted in fear and a lack of healthy boundaries being modeled.
That's a really clear connection. That constant need to over-explain as a defense mechanism learned way back.
Precisely. And Psychology Today also suggests oversharing can be this unconscious attempt at denormalization.
Denormalization?
Yeah. Like, if you grow up in an abusive home, that becomes your normal. You might not realize how not normal it was.
Right, until you see something else.
Exactly. So, as an adult, you might overshare, maybe hoping for a reaction from others, shock, disbelief that confirms your own gut feeling. Yeah, that wasn't normal. That was bad. Seeking that external validation, even by talking about painful things.
Ah, okay. That makes a strange kind of sense. The need for someone outside to say, whoa, that's not okay.
And they contrast this with undersharing, which you often see in survivors of other kinds of trauma who really want to avoid reliving it.
Interesting distinction. Okay, now how does the grit and virtue piece add to this picture?
Grit and virtue really emphasizes that basic human desire to be truly seen and known. They see that as a core motivator behind oversharing.
Okay.
But they highlight this paradox. You're trying to connect, but Oversharing often ends up making you feel more isolated or ashamed.
Right, the opposite effect.
Exactly. And they point out that for trauma survivors, that line between healthy vulnerability and oversharing gets really blurry because their difficult experiences have become, well, normalized for them.
So what feels like just sharing your reality to you might be completely overwhelming for someone else who hasn't lived through similar things.
Precisely. Grit and Virtue also mentions self-protection as a possible subconscious driver, like trying to get ahead of misunderstandings, maybe, or trying to lock down a relationship by putting everything on the table immediately. But, as we've kind of seen, that can backfire, leaves you feeling even more exposed.
Yeah.
And importantly, the article stresses self-compassion. When you notice these patterns in yourself, separate the behavior from your fundamental worthiness of love and connection. That's key.
That message of being kind to yourself through this feels really important.
It absolutely is. And Grit and Virtue give some usable self-reflection questions like, am I trying to meet a need right now? Was I just triggered? Could this trigger the person I'm talking to?
Practical things to ask yourself.
Yeah. And they also mention paying attention to your body. Those physical sensations can tell you if you actually feel safe sharing something in that moment, tuning into your gut feeling.
That body awareness piece is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so putting it all together from these sources, it's this complex mix, isn't it? Learned habits, needing validation, wanting connection, maybe even trying to protect yourself in a roundabout way.
Yeah.
All feeding into this urge to overshare, especially with a history of childhood trauma.
Yeah, that sums it up well.
But what are the real-world consequences then? How does this actually play out in relationships?
Well, all the sources pretty much agree on the potential negative impacts. Trauma dumping can put a real emotional strain on listeners, which can lead them to pull back, avoid the topic, or even avoid the person over time. It can damage intimacy. And there's always the risk of unintentionally triggering the listener's own stuff.
Right.
Plus, the often one-sided nature of it where the person sharing isn't really open to hearing feedback or making space for the listener's feelings, it can really hurt a balanced relationship.
And what about social media? Talkspace brought that up specifically, didn't they?
They did. They pointed out how social media can become a stage for trauma dumping, sometimes driven by that need for broad validation through likes and comments.
Yeah, performance versus connection.
Right. While online support can be great, constantly broadcasting trauma publicly might not build the deep reciprocal connection someone's actually looking for. And again, there's no real consent from the audience reading it.
It really drives home that point about being mindful, considering the other person, asking permission, no matter where you're sharing. So if someone recognizes these tendencies in themselves or finds themselves on the receiving end, what are some healthier ways forward?
The sources suggest several things. Therapy with a good professional is often top of the list, a safe space just for processing trauma.
Okay.
Journaling came up on Reddit, and in Grit and Virtue, a great tool for self-reflection, getting things out privately, also creative expression, finding relevant support groups like we talked about, and just actively developing other coping skills.
Right, building a toolkit.
Exactly. And in relationships, building trust slowly, gradually. Not dropping really heavy stuff right at the beginning. That came up in Reddit and Psychology Today, taking time to build real friendships. Slow and steady seems better for strong connections.
Slow and steady wins the connection race, maybe.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
And self-awareness is huge. Knowing your own patterns, your triggers around sharing,
Yeah.
and remembering healthy relationships need give and take, mutual support, reciprocity, making sure it flows both ways. It's also important to remember what someone on Reddit said, wanting closeness, wanting to share hard things. That's normal and healthy in good relationships. The problems start when it's unbalanced, ignores boundaries, or comes from a place of overwhelming unmet needs.
So it sounds like figuring out this balance between being vulnerable and oversharing is, well, it's a process.
Yeah.
Especially if past trauma is in the mix.
It really is. That basic human need for real connection is so strong. And if you've had a tough past, the urge to share your story can feel intense, often because you deeply need validation and understanding. But it's so important to build awareness around how and when we share, thinking about the impact, prioritizing consent, mutual respect. That's the groundwork for healthier relating.
So for you listening, as you think about your own sharing habits, the dynamics in your relationships, maybe consider some of those questions we talked about. Why are you sharing this right now? What might the impact be? Have you checked if the other person is ready to hear it? And if you're dealing with trauma's effects, exploring support groups or therapy could offer safer spaces designed for that kind of processing.
Absolutely. Ultimately, finding that sweet spot between vulnerability and healthy boundaries, it's an ongoing journey. You'll probably stumble sometimes. And self-compassion is just essential along the way.
Yeah.
The real goal is to build and nurture relationships based on mutual trust and respect, where, as that insightful Reddit comment put it so well, you can share both the sunshine and the shit appropriately in a way that actually deepens connection instead of causing harm or pushing people away.